Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with another short but juicy video. It's been a while, so let's get started. As always, thank you to Steven Erickson for sharing and commenting on my last video. I've got to thank him for a movie recommendation as well because in the in the video that I made about Quick Ben and Baukelane, he had mentioned this old Roger Corman movie called The Raven as his inspiration for the scene. So I managed to check it out. It was so awesome, right? Guys, you need to watch this. It's the perfect mix of horror and comedy and fantasy, and the entire cast is just one legend after another. I can't believe I hadn't seen it before. Of course, I'd heard of Roger Corman because he's a legend, and I've seen some of his other films as well, but I hadn't seen this one. So thank you, Steven Erickson, right, for that. That was just that movie was. There's a mage battle at the end, which is so funny and so well done, and it's such a, as one I guess would expect from a Roger Corman movie. It's just such a great example of how even with a small budget you can create a really fun fantasy story, right? That was awesome. I'd also like to give out two more shout outs. One to AP Canavan. He did a video that was, I mean, well, it wasn't a full response to my video, it was a partial response to it, but I'm going to take all the credit anyway. My ego was already at a dangerously high level, and now that there are guys with actual PhDs in fantasy making videos responding to mine, my sort of my ego is kind of completely out of control now. So thank you for that, AP. And finally, thank you to my friend Ishka Jarak for the T-shirt. I have another one that says 63 Gang. So this one has the logo of our Discord server and my channel as well. That was made by Bend. Thank you, Bend. So, and once again, thank you, Ishka, for the T-shirts. That was really nice of you. With all that said, let's get to the video because it's going to be a quick one anyway. So what I want to touch on, I've always wanted to do videos on military strategy in the 10 big books, but I never really got down to planning them out. So I thought, okay, you know what, as usual, let me just turn the camera on and rant. So what I wanted to touch on today, as you can probably see from the title, is the dichotomy of cold iron and hot iron in Malazan military thinking, military doctrine, military philosophy, however you want to sort of put it, right? So this idea that leaders on a battlefield can be dichotomized into cold iron and hot iron, and that this has a role on the impact of the war or the battle or the conflict or whatever. I just find that to be so cool. It's just such a tiny detail, right? And yet it just adds so much, and it's open to a lot of sort of discussion and conversation and analysis, right? So when you think about it, it makes sense because this, as Mathok puts it to us, on the one hand, it is proper military doctrine, but on the other hand, it's also something that veterans have passed on from one generation to another. This entire idea that some leaders are cold iron and some leaders are hot. So as far as cold iron goes, I think we can all cite numerous examples because there are many characters who are kind of specifically described as being cold iron. So Coltane, of course, Tavor, right? I mean, we hear over and over again to the point where we are like, okay, yes, she's cold iron, we get it. Leoman of the Flails. In terms of hot iron, we hear that Shaik is hot iron, but that's not a big thing. She's not really a good military leader. Kobolo Doom is hot iron, but who cares about that jackass, right? Kasa all along we hear can be both hot and cold, but when we look at it, Kasa, I think it's safer for us to say that Kasa is cold iron, is hot iron, right? From what we've seen of Kasa, I think it's safe for us to say that if we had to put him in one of those two boxes, it would be hot iron. Kala, in his younger days, would have probably been hot iron as well. In the final book, a good example of hot iron in action would be Gessler and Stormy leading the Kachen Chamal, right? Which I thought was a really nice touch because they are reckless and they are sort of okay. So maybe we should break down what the two mean, first of all, right? So cold iron is typically characterized by rational thinking. They might be introverts, right? The ones that we've seen seem to be introverts, very logical, very calculating, right? Not necessarily rather charismatic, but they still get people who can sort of follow them because they have that whole inner strength thing. Hot iron would be people who are characterized by sort of passion and action, and kind of they're quick to move. They can be impulsive. They can also be charismatic, and things like that. And the Malazan military doctrine basically tells us that when the two clash on a ratio of, I think Mattock says 4-1, cold iron wins out. That calculating, rational, strategic mind on a battlefield almost always wins out, even when the adversary is charismatic and full of energy and all that. So there are three observations that I just want to make in this video, right? So the first is how it's interesting to apply this to the real life, the real life records of military history and strategy and things like that. Because if you look at the great strategic thinkers throughout history, whether it's Kautilya, who wrote the Arthashastra, who's certainly cold iron, Sun Tzu, who wrote the Art of War, certainly cold iron. I don't know enough about Machiavelli, but I'm pretty sure that he was cold iron as well, right down to probably the most recent of the sort of great historical military strategists whom people read, Clausewitz, the Prussian general who wrote On War. He was cold iron as well. Whereas if we look at some of the kings and leaders and emperors, they typically tend to be described as hot iron. Right now, this could be perhaps just because of sycophantic historians, and perhaps it was just sort of that was the right thing to do, to kind of portray the king and the leader as this exuberant, charismatic individuals. But sort of Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, right up to the kind of modern 20th century Western larger-than-life ones like General Patton and Winston Churchill, many of them seem to be hot iron. So that's a cool dichotomy, or at least it's always been a cool dichotomy to me, that the strategic thinkers who've actually written about strategy and documented it, and whom we consider to be the sort of the pioneers of thinking that way, all of them seem to be cold iron in their sort of personality wise, whereas the political leaders, I mean, or even the kings, right, from a sort of a non-Western perspective, again, in the sort of on the Asian side, the Mughal dynasty, the Chola dynasty, the Ming dynasty in China, many of them really sort of celebrated many of their great conquerors and great kings who were part of their dynasty as hot iron. So does this mean that sort of the Malazan doctrine is not really in line with real life military doctrine? Not really, because in real life, sort of nobody really has made a mathematical calculation of what wins, right? Firstly, it would be hard for us to tell which leader is truly cold iron and hot iron, but I'm pretty sure that if we were to go through every single historical record and put it down, then perhaps there might be some truth to that, because even many of these emperors and kings would have had a number of advisors behind them, and many of those advisors would have probably advised caution. Anyway, let's not get too derailed. So that was one observation that I always found cool about applying cold iron and hot iron to real life military knowledge and history, right? The other thing that makes me really like the whole concept of cold iron and hot iron, number one, is that typically in fantasy fiction, people don't really discuss military doctrine. They discuss military strategy and history, and oh, this is here, this is there, we've got to go here, we've got to go there, and things like that. But just a small informal sort of unofficial way of thinking like this that's been passed down from generation to generation. Just ground level, I guess, infantry doctrine, right? The idea of cold iron and hot iron. I thought that was really cool. You don't really get that in military theory today. You don't really get that in strategic discussions today. In fact, almost all sort of discussions on personality and military capability these days is just centered on leadership. Everybody's obsessed with sort of leadership courses and military war colleges all over the world having kind of guest speakers on to come and talk about leadership. You need to be a leader, blah, 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 blah. The whole idea that your personality puts you into one of these kind of age-old categories, and that your aptitude as a tactician or a strategist on a battlefield would depend on that. That's not really something that's in fashion in military studies today. I can see why, right? In the age of biological enhancements and artificial intelligence and 3D printing, invisibility technology, right? Nanotechnology, hypersonic missiles, and all that. There's just so much disruptive technology coming along, and even the most advanced military powers in the world are essentially scrambling, trying to kind of just keep up with the rapid innovation that's happening in civilian technology. That I can see why this link between personality and the tide of battle is not a very fashionable topic to kind of do research on anymore, to even kind of speak about anymore, right? Even though we can clearly see from the sort of general pattern, Winston Churchill example, that these figures, or Mussolini, right, that kind of these figures to their own fan bases always have a certain allure, because hot iron always comes with a large amount of charisma, right? Finally, the last point I want to touch on was how this sometimes applies to the races in the Malazan world. As in, if you think about it, all races do have their own version of cold iron being turned to hot iron, or hot being turned to cold. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the Tilanaimas, for example, right, in their zombie forms, they are cold iron. They are the sort of the sort of the perfect version of cold iron, in the sense that they are literally emotionless and unfeeling and things like that. They used to be a mortal race. They used to be pretty much a normal race. They turned themselves into cold iron in order to win the war against the Jagut. They turned themselves into cold iron in order to kind of, I guess, save the rest of us, right, from the prospect of a tyrant in the future. On the flip side of that, we also see races whose features are more attributable to cold iron, wanting to go the other way. So the Kachen Chamal, for example, you could say that they're sort of a reptilian race. I don't mean cold iron and cold-blooded are not necessarily the same thing, right? But they kind of are this reptilian cold race, whatever. I mean, for the sake of my analogy, let's just say they were cold iron, but they still needed hot iron in the end, in the form of Gessler and Stormy, in order to sort of take them through, to save the day, to win the day, rather, to win the war, right? So this dichotomy of hot iron and cold iron is not just a military tactic. It's not just a military doctrine or truism or whatever it is. We see that theme being played out in conflicts all over the Malazan universe, in terms of the races, in terms of the nations, and things like that. If you look at the T standee, for example, this whole idea of giving them purpose, they are cold iron to such an extent that somebody needs to throw them in the fire, which is what Rake does. Rake tries to kind of give them a reason to live, give them some kind of passion, some kind of cause. Because if you become sort of, if you go overboard with the cold iron thing, then you end up like Leoman, right? Where you have no problem doing what he did when it came to the siege of Yucatan. So once again, guys, this was just a short video, a rambling video with some of my thoughts on cold iron and hot iron, because I always thought that this was one of those little gold nuggets that's just there in the books, and is just there for someone to pick out and look at, right? So hopefully that's what we did in the video, and I will try to upload more. I have a few more ideas for the whole military doctrine in Malazan thing. I want hopefully touch on the idea of the use of civilians in battle, which is what Leoman does. So going into that, the idea of war crimes, right, and the laws of war in general, and perhaps how they might apply in a Malazan context and things like that. So I have a few ideas. So hopefully in the next couple of days, you will get more content from me. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.